Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Happy St. Patrick's Day. And thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is David Laub, and I am the son of a Holocaust survivor. I would like to tell you the story of my father, Walter Laub, but it is also my story, and my entire family's story as well. The pictures you see in this first slide are of my dad during World War II, and then later in his life. Let me begin by saying all Holocaust stories are unique. My father's is certainly no exception. He was a survivor on two fronts, both as a Jewish refugee fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe in 1939, and as a newly naturalized US citizen serving in the US Army starting in 1940 and helping to liberate Europe in 1944 and 45. His two-front survivor guilt left him emotionally scarred, and as his youngest son, left me enmeshed in his story that became a multi-generational story of surviving survivor guilt. I've struggled for decades to overcome the wounds he inadvertently passed on to me, but I will always be indebted to him. Leaving his mother, Betty Laub, behind when he fled his home in Austria, Vienna, Austria, was the source of his survivor guilt. And I, the dutiful son, absorbed that guilt and transformed it into a family-first mission. As part of that mission, it is my legacy to love and honor my father. And this narrative is how I've helped make his memory my blessing. Let me start this narrative with my paternal grandmother, Betty Laub, who was the truest family victim of the Holocaust. Betty was born in a very small town of Balatinjec in western Serbia in July of 1875. At that point, Serbia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She moved to Hungary as a small child and then moved to Vienna as a teenager and later married Leon Laub. She was left behind, perhaps with her permission, by my father after the Nazi Anschluss of Austria. In English, Anschluss means annexation or absorption, and that happened in March of 1938. But I can't say for sure whether her permission was granted because that was a core secret in the Laub family that none of us ever dared talk about. In the picture, you see the European map of her birth, Serbia, later part of Yugoslavia, then her adult life in Vienna, and then her final deportation to Poland. She was deported to the Bulge ghetto in Poland in October of 41 as part of the Nazi final solution of exterminating all Jews still living in Nazi-occupied Europe. She died in the Bulge ghetto in late December of 41, really only 2 months later. The probable causes were fear, exhaustion, starvation, or disease. Once again, I can never know for sure. No one in my family ever tried to find out. It was simply too traumatic for my father to ever dig into this unfinished business. So let me begin my father's Holocaust story in earnest. He was born in August 1910 in Vienna, Austria. Picture on the left, you see my dad as a young man. He died in late December of 1971 in Chicago at age 61, 30 years to the day after his mother, Betty, died in the Lodz ghetto, shortly after her deportation from Vienna in 41, well after my father had fled Austria in 39. His father, as I mentioned, was Leon, and he died of natural causes prior to the Nazi era. He ran a construction business, and some of his buildings may still be standing in Vienna. He changed the family name to the more Germanic Laub, but the previous name is lost in history. My father's profession prior to the Nazi era was a commercial artist, a department store window dresser. He was an avid skier and motorcycle driver. And he was sort of a bon vivant with many girlfriends. The seminal life event for him was the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, in March of 39, when Nazi Germany annexed independent Austria. Austrian Jews instantly faced the same choiceless choices that gradually crept over German Jews over a 5-year period from 33 to 38, most notably the reenactment of the Nuremberg laws, where Jews lost their citizenship and the ability to work in most businesses. Faced with no apparent way out, there was a wave of Jewish Austrian suicides, and all doubt of surviving the Nazi regime was erased on Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, in November of 38, where thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues were burned to the ground throughout Germany and Austria. My father then quickly had to decide whether to flee or stay, and whether to leave his mother behind. So in a very real sense, his story is the age-old story of duty versus desire, and my family first mission was shaped by this struggle. In the wake of the Anschluss, my father made the difficult decision to flee Austria 6 months later in August of 1939. He left his mother behind to escape. Like too many Jews, she was too settled in a previously comfortable life and foolishly waited too long for the storm to pass. My father was 29 and his mother was 65. He swam the Danube River under cover of darkness in the first leg of his escape. Upon crossing into France from Switzerland, he was arrested as a German Reich enemy alien and spent 6 months in an internment camp in France near Bordeaux. Being a Jewish refugee was irrelevant to the French officials. The camp had very poor living conditions with barely any medical attention and near starvation rations. My father's official immigration story, he found a non-relative with the same name, Benjamin Laub, in a New York City phone book to sponsor him in immigrating to the US. However, the sponsor may have been a blood relative. This minority report comes from my cousin, Ilana Laub, from Los Angeles, and this certainly would have made his refugee documentation for entry into the US far simpler. He arrived in the US in February of 1940, 3 months prior to the collapse of France during the Nazi military victory in May of 40. If his departure had been delayed even by a few months, he almost certainly would have died in a concentration camp or death camp. In the picture, you see a ship arriving in the New York harbor and the ship manifest, and you can see my father's name and his profession, a window dresser, listed in the last line of the ship manifest. My father worked initially in the New York City garment district in a job found by his sponsor, Benjamin Laub, until Walter was quickly drafted into the US Army. Now, this is a conjecture. Perhaps my dad beat the draconian immigration quota system in place in the US at that time at a stiff price. Was there a US State Department de facto decision to use some Jewish men as cannon fodder, i.e. let them die first in the upcoming war? But regardless of conjecture, many Jewish refugees were drafted, a rather ambivalent welcome to America. My father served with the 29th Infantry Regiment from Fort Benning, Georgia. You can see the pictures of his infantry regiment banner, "We Lead the Way," and on the bottom his dog tags, which I carry to this day on my keychain. And you'll note that letter H stamped into the lower right corner. We'll speak more about that a little bit later. My father learned to speak perfect, unaccented English, no small feat at 30 to 31, and he started a mail order correspondence through the Jewish support group B'nai B'rith with my mother Beatrice, her story also on the following slide. And he started this relationship, you can see that letter in the middle, you can almost see the stamp on it, July 27th of 1941, 5 years later to the day, my older brother Leonard was born. And that date, July 27th in 1946, was exactly 9 months to the day after my father returned to Chicago after the war. Do the math. The remaining picture on the right, the happy couple, Walter and Beatrice Laub. My father finally met my mother in Chicago at the end of October of 41, nearly the exact time his mother was deported from Vienna to Lodz. And he married my mother, whirlwind romance, In late December 1941, at nearly the exact time his mother died in the Lodz ghetto. Beatrice was 19, my father was 31. The age gap was a detail they always hid from me. Yet another Laub family secret. My father became a naturalized US citizen thanks to his Army service in 1942. He was deployed to Iceland in 1943 in anticipation of a Nazi invasion, which never occurred. Picture on the left, you see the Northern Lights rainbow, a hand-drawn card to my mother with a photo we saw in the previous slide. Another example of the artist at work, even in wartime. My dad was deployed to Normandy, the world-famous Omaha Beach, in July of 1944, and he participated in the liberation of France in August and September of 44. Picture on the right, you see my dad winning hearts and minds with Parisian children. He saw heavy combat in the Battle of the Bulge, December to January 44 and 45, and narrowly avoided death or capture in Belgium. But he never threw away his dog tags, even during combat. Captured Jewish GIs could be sent to concentration camps, not prisoners of war, and this in fact happened on many occasions. Those dog tags, the US Army marked them with H for Hebrew or Jew for burial services. But there were frequently deadly consequences of that seemingly innocent letter H. He remained virtually silent about this experience for the rest of his life. A strong example of latent post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD. I continue now with my father's role in the largest battle ever fought by the US Army and the deadliest battle for Americans in World War II. The battle was Hitler's desperate gamble to split American and British allies and stop the Allied advance into Germany. The Nazis had the largest and most advanced armored tanks, along with superior winter fighting gear. And there were many Nazi commandos dressed as US Army soldiers trying to create confusion, and they succeeded. Entire American divisions melted away and were taken prisoner in the Nazi onslaught. Bad weather was the Nazis' secret weapon in neutralizing the US Army Air Corps, but the weather eventually cleared and the tide turned. The pictures you see on the left, a battlefield sketch my father drew during actual combat, the cool and collected artist, even under fire. In the middle, my dad with an M1 semi-automatic machine gun. And on the right, my father alive and happy to be so. In the battle, there were heroes large. I'm sure you've heard of the 101st Airborne and General George Patton, and small, like my father. My father was part of a determined and larger band of brothers who improvised, reorganized, and stood their ground in the heat of battle, and had the courage to be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice in defeating the Nazi Third Reich, and never surrender. Unlike, for example, the young Kurt Vonnegut, the author of Slaughterhouse-5, and his entire division were captured and became prisoners of war. My father participated in the liberation of Germany throughout the first half of 1945. In the pictures, you see civilians contemplating and ignoring the widespread destruction of the German city of Frankfurt am Main. Another conjecture, my father likely participated in the liberation of Nazi concentration camps in March through April of 1945. I can't know for sure because he never spoke of it. German-speaking Jewish GIs were golden to the US Army, both for interrogating Jewish prisoners and their Nazi guards. His thoughts potentially, this could have been me, or perhaps this should have been me. What if he met his neighbors, someone who knew his mother or her whereabouts? What if he actually met his mother? Perhaps most relevantly, what efforts, if any, did he make through the Red Cross or other aid organizations to find her? Sadly, the answer appears to be none. He ended his war service with the rank of Staff Sergeant. He refused the battlefield commission to the rank of lieutenant. He didn't want the responsibility. And he suffered a band of brothers' soldier guilt for fallen comrades, combined with his Jewish survivor guilt, which was still raw even after 30 years. He was assigned to General Eisenhower's headquarters battalion at the end of the war and interrogated Nazi officers. And he was discharged from the US Army in October of 45. Being married and older kept him from the planned deployment to the Pacific and the planned invasion of Japan. Upon return to the United States, he threw away all his service medals and ribbons, an incredibly sad example of my father feeling perpetually dishonorable. To start the post-World War II years, we see the picture on the left of the discharge button. This is a nice example of my father's sarcasm and honesty. The inscription is the best decoration the War Department has to offer, the discharge button. He worked briefly as a carpenter and then a window dresser at Mandel Brothers department store in Chicago. And he ran a gas station and auto repair store in Rogers Park in Chicago for 15 years. He enjoyed being his own boss, but he went bankrupt. He had poor business skills, and in a community-facing business, contacts are everything. But my father went out of his way to go it alone. As a small irony, the service station he ran is now a small Orthodox Jewish synagogue. My mother then became the primary breadwinner. She went back to college and became a Chicago public school teacher. My father then became the family chef, at that point far surpassing my mother's skill in cooking. And he wouldn't accept West German reparations, as this would have necessitated him owning up to the past and seeking his mother's history. He never considered psychotherapy, considered a luxury expense back then. And he certainly had a long, unacknowledged battle with PTSD and depression. But he continued as an avid sketch artist and photographer, and he adored the TV comic Ernie Kovacs. He loved his offbeat wit. And he enrolled in classes at the Art Institute of Chicago, helping to stave off depression and refocus his artistic abilities. The picture in the middle, a rather mixed Father's Day message with an honest beer belly. And on the right, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a telling doodle of depression and guilt, meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Laub. He survived a bout with bladder cancer in his 50s, and he became a maintenance engineer at the Bernard Horwich Jewish Community Center after his bankruptcy. My mother got him the job, and he died of a heart attack in late December of 1971, 30 years to the day after his mother died. I continue now with some family sketches in order to broaden and expand the narrative to include fully 2 generations of Laubs, directly and indirectly affected by the Holocaust, Beatrice Laub, my mother, and myself. Beatrice Kolokovsky Laub was born March 25th in 1922 in Chicago. She died in March of 1983, 2 days short of her 61st birthday. She was the daughter of Abraham and Molly Kolokovsky from Kiev, Russia. Abraham, after being conscripted into the Tsar's army for 10 years, immigrated to the US in 1910, the same year my father was born, and worked in Chicago as a printer typesetter. In the picture on the left, you see the Kolokovsky family, and then my mother Beatrice, the college graduate, receiving her master's degree in education, and then later on in life. Her family name was repeatedly Americanized, first Kolokov, and then K. Think the comedian Danny Kaye. She had an adored older brother, Joseph, who served in the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression, creating Chicagoland forest preserves, who died suddenly of polio at age 22. And she was the mother of my older brother, Leonard, and myself. She was raised in an Orthodox Jewish household, and she was baffled and depressed by my father's post-war atheism. Neither of her boys were raised in a religious manner or celebrated a bar mitzvah. She absorbed my father's Holocaust story, but only small snippets survived. As mentioned before, many of these narratives are quite sketchy because I simply have no further details. She worked as a secretary for the Bernard Horwich JCC in Chicago, and she went back to school, finishing her bachelor's and master's at Northeastern Illinois University after my father had gone bankrupt, and she served as a Chicago public school teacher for 10 years. And then there's me, the leap year baby, February 29th, 1952. And in the pictures we have the gentle march of time, my older brother Leonard gently harassing his younger brother, me, my formal graduation picture from Mather High School, and then the older David harassing the world as the infamous barber Sweeney Todd. I was picked out of a crowd of 10-year-old summer campers at the JCC by folk singing legend Ella Jenkins to sing the solo San Francisco Bay Blues with my guitar on Channel 11 WTTW soundstage program. I guess you could say that was my 15 minutes of fame until much later. I got my bachelor's degree in math in 1973 and my master's degree from DePaul University in 1982. I worked as a computer programmer for 45 years and I'm now retired. I married in September of 1978 to Susan Rector Laub. We were married for 41 years. Susan died in 2019. I'm currently a docent at the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and I am an avid musical theater and operetta performance. My boyhood talent for singing reemerged late, but better late than never. I starred in that community theater production of Sweeney Todd in 2013, and also in the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, Pirates of Penzance. And as I mentioned before, I remain deeply affected by my father's saga and his survivor guilt. Before I conclude this presentation, excuse me, I'd like to share some relevant vignettes, first focusing on my father's and mother's love. And each picture tells, or at least focuses on, a vignette. On the left, we have David with the extremely puffy cheeks. I don't know if you're able to see that, getting the mumps. And Walter and Beatrice Laub helped come to the rescue. I had my share of childhood diseases, including mumps. And upon picking up a liquid prescription for me for the mumps, my father fashioned a usable spoon out of a piece of paper so I could have it immediately. With that, and some tender loving care from my mother, I was cured in no time. In the middle, you see father and son, my dad, the happy cook, letting me lick the spoon of one of his wonderful sauces. Could I learn at a tender age that Hungarian goulash is really better than mac and cheese? And then finally on this slide, the art project. In the 8th grade, I had to do a major at-home art project, which completely eluded me. My father, the artist, rescued me by creating a portrait of my favorite toy animal, Beagle Biggie. And even though that portrait was completely beyond my artistic abilities, it nevertheless wowed and fooled my art teacher. Some more vignettes and some more additional father and son moments with some stock photos. Once again, each picture telling or focusing on a vignette. We start with sunrise over the lakefront in Chicago. My father thought that 5 a.m. was the best part of the day, especially when watching the sunrise over Lake Michigan. So one day, very early, he dragged his boys to the beach, but we were less than overwhelmed when Dad's enthusiasm was met with teenage boredom. My response when it was over, "Can we go home now?" In the middle, sketching a rabbit on the walk. When we were walking in Rogers Park one day, we spied a young rabbit. And my father then interrupted the walk, pulled out his sketch pad, and made a quick drawing, paying his respects to the master artist, Albrecht Dürer. I thought it was a little strange at the time, but in retrospect, I realized how much it meant to him to recapture his love for nature and animals. And then we have Lincoln Park Zoo and the seals. Lincoln Park Zoo is another favorite spot of my father's, especially the seal pond in good or bad weather. And our last visit there was the last quality time we had together before his fatal heart attack. On the day my father died, he suffered a massive heart attack in front of my mother and me. I spontaneously administered mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which miraculously worked. My father lived a few more hours, but on his deathbed spoke to me specifically, saying I had good vibes, a benediction from father to son that I will always cherish. When I finally asked him, what happened to you before the war? He shrugged and replied, thank God it never happened to you. My thoughts, the deathbed serenity, was he simply glad it was all over, coming to grips with mortality? Had he made his peace with God? Did he experience a visit from his mother's spirit, or all three? These are unanswerable, but wonderful to think about. I'd like to conclude with some general and family-specific lessons. In terms of general lessons, the mental pain the Nazis created in their victims lived on in many of their victims, and for some, lives on in the victims' children. It created a modern variant of the sins of the father, in which World War II is still being fought, in a sense, by their children, which leads me to this quote. The past is never dead. It's not even past. This is a quite relevant William Faulkner, American author, quote, featured on the wall of the Illinois Holocaust Museum Theater. When Faulkner wrote this, he had no idea how generally relevant this quote would become and how specifically relevant it would be for the family Laub. In addition to the greatest crime of the Nazis in murdering 6 million Jews, they perpetrated a secondary crime in the scars they left on innocent people, who were forced to make choiceless choices in order to survive. Psychologically, a survivor may see himself as a criminal, but objectively, they remain a victim of the actual criminals. In terms of family-specific lessons, my father may not always have been the hero of his story, but he was certainly never the villain. If there was a blessing for my father that overcame his survivor guilt, it was that he lived and loved and created a family. He not only survived and created a family, but he had unwavering courage on the front lines in combat, defeating the Nazi Third Reich. My father never really got past his survivor guilt, but for the most part, with the aid of friends, family, introspection, and psychotherapy, I've been mostly successful in overcoming my second-generation trauma. His memory and the lessons he taught me consciously or otherwise will always be my blessing. So I thank you for your kind attention. I leave you with more images of Walter Laub and his sons together in some family times. First, we have a formal portrait with me and my brother and I, the father and son bonding on a summer day, and of course, Lincoln Park Zoo. And thank you again for tuning in to Facebook Live. If you have any questions, I'd be delighted to try and answer them in our Q&A segment starting in just a few moments. Join us here next Wednesday, March 24th, at a special time, 2:30 p.m. Central Time, to hear third-generation speaker, Jamie Frankel, share her family's story. Please keep an eye on the Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content throughout the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times.
Thank you, David. We do have a couple questions.
Oh, good.
When did you first start to hear your father's story? When did he begin sharing that?
You know, it was mostly only as a teenager that I heard them. He kept a very tight control over his Holocaust story. I mean, it was always simmering in the background. Children are very perceptive that there's something wrong, but he really couldn't articulate it. As a teenager, I finally worked up the courage to try and talk to him about it, and he literally ran out of the room crying. I picked up a few details, maybe as a 10-year-old, from my mother, but even she knew very little, and she really didn't want to probe too deeply into it either.
So over the years, how much of the story did you have to kind of go through and do some extra digging for?
Pretty much 80 to 90% of it. I picked up a little recently from my cousin Alana Laub, who lives in LA, and throughout the years, a little bit from my brother, Leonard Laub. But I mean, it is sad that every family's history is important to them. I'm not saying my history is any more compelling than any other, but without a family historian, a lot of it got lost, and there was shame in my father's story. There was heroism and shame, and in some horrible sense, they canceled each other out. So very little was written down. Like, my father was drafted, but did he in fact quit his job in the garment district? Was he fired from his job? I mean, I'll never know. Every family should appoint a family historian early and write their story down, or at least videotape it, because even though my story is vital, I'm patching it together in some senses, like frog DNA being used in Jurassic Park to finish the dinosaur. I don't know where the dinosaur ends and the frog begins.
That is a brilliant analogy. So what brought you to kind of sharing his story in this multi-generational survivor guilt that you talk about?
It's a story that I really needed to tell people. I mean, I've told a little bit in psychotherapy, but I want to honor my father. I want to bring peace and resolution and closure to the past that he was never able to do. I became a docent in large part to honor him, even though I'm a secular Jew. And telling his story has been tremendously therapeutic and important for me, and I hope informative and instructive to a more general population.
Very much so. It looks like I've got one more question.
Okay.
It's kind of a nice wrap-up question too. What is the takeaway and the kind of lesson you want people to leave with after hearing your story?
I want everyone to look at their family and hug them. I want everyone who loves their family to realize that their family members are flawed, but every human being is flawed, and find a way to integrate and get beyond that. And I want people to be aware that the Holocaust happened and could happen again, not necessarily to Jews, then perhaps Muslims or other minorities, and make sure, damn sure, that by speaking out and being an upstander, that no Holocaust, be it for Jews or other minorities, ever happens again.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone who listened.